I found out about my son's wedding from my hospital bed. My husband was there. A stranger texted, "Don't say a word, I'll handle it. The morphine drip makes everything soft around the edges." That's what I kept telling myself when I first saw it, that I was reading it wrong, that the medication was doing something to my comprehension, that the photograph on my phone screen was not what it looked like. It was 11:17 in the morning on a Thursday in October. I know the exact time because I just checked the clock on the wall, the kind with the white face and black numerals that hospitals hang in every room so you never forget that time is, in fact, passing, and calculated how many hours until the next vitals check, the way you do when lying still is the only thing on your agenda. My son Davian had posted the photo 11 minutes earlier. White aisle, floral arch, a woman in a fitted ivory dress, young, beautiful, a little nervous in the jaw, standing across from my son in a navy suit I didn't recognize. I didn't recognize it because I'd never seen it, because I hadn't been there when he bought it, because I hadn't been there at all. The caption read, "What a joyful day. Thank you to my real mother and father for everything. Real mother." My husband Byron was in the third photo. Charcoal gray suit I did recognize. Big smile. Standing with his arm around a woman I had never seen in my life. Shoulder-length locks, a wine-colored dress, easy posture, like she belonged exactly where she was standing. He had liked Davian's post. Just a small thumbs up. Sitting there at the bottom of the screen. Casual. Like it cost him nothing. I lay in that hospital bed, IV in my left arm, surgical drain still in place from a hysterectomy I'd had 5 days prior, in a room I'd been alone in since the second day, and I stared at that screen until my eyes burned dry. Then my phone buzzed. Unknown number, 7 words. Don't say a word. I'll handle it. My name is Thessaly Vance Rourke. I'm 53 years old. I was a middle school vice principal for 11 years in Charlotte, North Carolina, before I transitioned to district curriculum coordination, which is the kind of job that sounds important to people outside education and sounds exhausting to everyone inside it. I've managed crisis protocols, IEP disputes, staff grievances, and the particular species of institutional chaos that only a public school system can generate. I say all of that because I need you to understand. I am not a woman who falls apart. I was raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs and considered crying in front of your children a form of negligence. I gave birth to Davian at 24 without an epidural because the anesthesiologist was in another room and I simply didn't wait. I held it together at my mother's funeral, at my father-in-law's funeral, during the year Byron lost his freight business, and I quietly floated our household on my salary alone without mentioning it more than once. I know how to stay vertical when everything else is tipping sideways, but I want to tell you what I was doing 5 days before that photograph. I was lying on a surgical table at Atrium Health Carolina's medical center while Dr. Fenella Osei-Bonsu, OBGYN, 17 years in practice, a woman with steady hands and the specific kind of calm that surgeons develop when they've seen enough that almost nothing rattles them anymore, removed a uterus that had been trying to kill me for the better part of 2 years. Fibroids, the kind that stack and spread and hemorrhage without warning, the kind that had landed me in the ER twice in 8 months before we all agreed that watchful waiting had run its course. Byron had driven me to the hospital on surgery day. He'd sat with me through prep. He'd kissed my forehead before they wheeled me back and said, "Call me when you're out." He was there when I woke up, briefly. He asked how I felt, said I looked good, told me he'd be back the next morning. He did not come back the next morning. I called it work stress. There was always something with Byron, a shipment delay, a contractor dispute, a call that ran long. He'd been rebuilding the freight brokerage for 2 years since the original collapse, and there was a specific kind of hypervigilance he carried around it, the way a man who has failed once watches every variable like it might betray him. I understood that. I had funded that understanding quietly from my own account. I told myself he was handling something. I told myself a lot of things in that room while the IV dripped and the nurses changed shifts and the morphine wore down to a dull ache and then just an ache. By day 3, I'd stopped calling. On day 4 of my hospital stay, a nurse named Tanya, mid-30s, no nonsense, the kind of person who tells you what your numbers actually mean rather than offering you soft reassurances, mentioned that my hemoglobin had dropped overnight and they were extending my stay by a day for monitoring. I thanked her. She asked if there was anyone she could call. I said I was fine. That night, I looked at Byron's Instagram for the first time in weeks. He didn't post much. He used it mainly to follow sports accounts and occasionally like things Davian posted. I scrolled back 3 weeks and found nothing unusual. Then I checked his location sharing, which we'd turned on 2 years ago after he got a flat tire on I-85 at 1 a.m., and it took 40 minutes to figure out where he was. His location had been turned off since August 31st. I'd noticed that before, and he'd said his phone had done it automatically after an update. He'd offered to turn it back on, and I'd waved it off. It felt small. It didn't feel small now. I lay with the phone face down on my chest and looked at the ceiling tiles and thought about the way Byron had kissed my forehead before surgery. The specific quality of that kiss. I'd been so grateful for it, so relieved that he was there, that he had come, that the version of Byron I'd married was still in that waiting room while they took me back. I'd held that feeling through recovery, used it as evidence that I was being paranoid. It was 2:31 a.m. before I slept. The manila envelope arrived at the nurse's station on day 5, the morning before I was to be discharged. Tanya brought it to me herself, which wasn't standard protocol, and which she acknowledged with a small shrug. Someone had called ahead, she said, used Byron's name to confirm my room number, left the envelope at the front front desk with no return address, paid a courier service, and was gone before anyone thought to ask for ID. Inside, arranged in order, were the following items: bank transfer records, 4 pages, printouts from what appeared to be a Truist business account, one I didn't recognize, showing 2 incoming wire transfers, $18,500 dated March 12th, $12,500 dated June 3rd, $31,000 total. The originating account name on both transfers, S. Adebowale Frost. A business proposal document, 12 pages. Letterhead reading Meridian Freight Solutions, LLC. Byron's name, our address. A photograph of him I recognized from LinkedIn. The pitch was professional. Logistics infrastructure, Southeast distribution corridor, projected ROI inside 18 months. The kind of proposal that reads as legitimate to someone who wants it to be. A printed email chain, 31 messages. The name in the thread, Salvina Adebowale Frost. The tone of the early emails, purely transactional, investor to operator. The tone of later ones, warmer. First names, one from Byron in June that read, in full, you've been more patient than I deserve. I'll make this right. Things with my ex are complicated but almost resolved. His ex. I set that page down, picked it back up, read it again. At the bottom of the envelope was our marriage certificate, pulled from Mecklenburg County Public Records, still legally valid, issued in 2001. 22 years of marriage, reduced to a document someone had thought to include as evidence. There was a handwritten note on the back of a receipt. Small, blue ink, slightly uneven. He told me he was divorced. I believed him. I'm sorry. You deserved better than both of us leaving you alone in here. I read every page twice. Then I found the line that made my stomach drop entirely. Buried in the transfer records. A prior transaction. 8 months before Salvina's first payment. $8,400 transferred from a joint checking account into Meridian Freight Solutions, LLC, our joint account. The account my salary went into every 2 weeks, where we kept household expenses and savings and the fund we'd been building for the eventual purchase of a house in Mooresville, where Byron said he wanted to retire near the lake. He had used my money to build the credibility to take hers. Not borrowed, not discussed, not repaid. Used. I set the folder down on the hospital tray table. The room was very quiet, just the low hum of the monitoring equipment and the distant sound of a call button somewhere down the hall. My hands, when I looked at them, were completely still. I picked up my phone and opened my contacts. I had added Renata Pascoe's number 4 months earlier, after a conversation at a district professional development event where she'd given a brief talk on financial rights for women in dissolution proceedings. I'd added it the way you add a number you hope you never use. She answered on the second ring. Ms. Vance Rourke, she said. I'm in the hospital, I said. I have documents I need you to look at. Can we meet when I'm discharged tomorrow? Tell me what you have, I told her. There was a pause on her end, the kind a good attorney makes when they're not expressing surprise, but are internally reclassifying the situation. Renata Pascoe had been practicing family law in Charlotte for 19 years. She had handled, by her own estimate at that event, over 800 dissolution cases. She knew what she was hearing. Don't move anything, she said. Don't confront him. Don't change your behavior. Can you do that? Yes, I said. I'll have intake paperwork ready for you tomorrow afternoon. And Thessaly, she paused again. You did exactly the right thing. I hung up and looked out the window at the parking deck and thought about the fact that Byron had kissed my forehead before my surgery, and that while I was recovering, he had gone to our son's wedding with a woman he'd told he was divorced, and liked the photos from a hospital waiting room or a parking lot or wherever he'd been when he pulled out his phone and pressed that small, casual, costless thumbs up. I cried once, quietly, face turned toward the wall so Tanya wouldn't see when she came in for rounds. Then I stopped. Byron came home 2 days after I did. He arrived with groceries nobody had asked him to buy. The specific kind of unsolicited gesture that reads as consideration but is actually a form of management. Fresh flowers, the pasta I liked, a carton of the orange juice I'd been craving since before the surgery. He moved through our kitchen with the easy confidence of a man performing normalcy for an audience of one. He asked how I was feeling. He said he was sorry he'd been scarce. The freight situation had gotten complicated. There was a potential partnership that required his full attention. He'd been managing it in real time and he knew the timing was terrible. He said it in the particular way he'd been saying things like that for years. Sincerely, with genuine eye contact, with just enough specific detail to make the explanation feel solid. I smiled where smiling was appropriate. I thanked him for the groceries. I gave him nothing to read. The next morning, while Byron showered, I moved through the house with my phone. Behind the entryway table, a charger. Not Byron's model, which was a black Samsung brick. Not mine, which was white Apple. This one was a white USB-C cube, slightly different dimensions. Someone else's charger, left behind by accident or through the specific carelessness of someone who had started to feel at home in a place that wasn't theirs. I photographed it, left it exactly where it was. In the kitchen junk drawer, a restaurant receipt. Le Méridien Bar and Kitchen, dated a Tuesday night in September when Byron had texted me from what he said was a conference in Raleigh. I remembered that night because I'd replied, "Drive safe, call me when you're back at the hotel," and he'd responded with a thumbs up emoji, and I'd fallen asleep waiting for the follow-up call that hadn't come. The receipt was for 2 entrees, wine, dessert, $187.40. Raleigh is 90 minutes from Charlotte. Le Méridien Bar and Kitchen was 4 miles from our house. I photographed it, closed the drawer. In his home office, and I want to be precise here, because I had never gone through Byron's office before, because I had always considered considered his professional space his private space, because 22 years of marriage had built in me certain habits of trust that I was only now understanding had been load-bearing in ways I hadn't examined. I found a business card from a commercial real estate firm. Handwritten on the back, Unit 7, Westover Industrial, 4800 SQFT, 3200 MO, loading dock access, climate zone B. Byron's theoretical freight brokerage had always been theoretical to me, a concept, an aspiration, something he talked about at dinner and researched on weekends and described with the particular brightness he got when something excited him. He wasn't theorizing a business, he was building one, with warehouse space already scoped, with a lease structure already priced, with Salvina Addabawal Frost's $31,000 sitting in an LLC account that my name was nowhere near, and with $8,400 of my money underneath it all like a foundation he'd poured without asking. I photographed the business card, replaced it at the same angle, closed his office door. Then I called Renata back and told her to file. I need to tell you about Salvina. Salvina Addabawal Frost was 44 years old, a logistics operations manager at a mid-size import firm in Gastonia, and, as I would learn over several phone conversations that began with extreme wariness on both our parts and gradually became something else entirely, a woman who had been told convincingly and repeatedly that Byron Rourke was a divorced man building a second act after a painful marriage ended. She had met him at an industry networking event in April of last year. He'd been charming, specific, knowledgeable about freight infrastructure in ways that impressed her professionally. They'd had dinner twice before she agreed to look at the business proposal. She'd run it by her brother, who did private equity work in Atlanta, and said the fundamentals looked solid. She'd wired the first installment in March. By June, she'd started to wonder. Small things. He was never available on weekends. He didn't have social media she could find. He deflected questions about his living situation with smooth, practiced ease. She hired a private investigator named Terrence Whitlow. Terrence Whitlow had 26 years of experience in domestic investigation and asset tracing, including 15 years as a licensed PI in North Carolina, and he found our marriage certificate, our joint address, and our joint filing status in approximately 3 business days. Salvina had been sitting on that information for 6 weeks, she told me, trying to figure out what to do with it when Davian posted the wedding photos. She recognized Byron immediately. The unknown number. 7 words. Don't say a word. I'll handle it. She'd found my name through Terrence. She'd found my hospital room through a combination of Byron's calendar. He'd mentioned the surgery, once, obliquely, as a medical situation with a family member, and the kind of methodical, controlled anger that makes people surprisingly good at logistics. When we finally spoke by phone, 4 days after I was discharged, once I'd confirmed with Renata that speaking to Salvina wouldn't compromise the legal filing, the first thing she said was, "I want you to know I'm furious with myself." "Don't be," I said. "He's very good at this. I should have checked sooner. He's very good at making you feel like checking would be an insult." There was a pause. Then she said quietly, "Yes, that's exactly right." Renata had filed for divorce on a Tuesday morning. By Thursday, she had also forwarded Salvina's documentation, with Salvina's full written consent, to Detective Alonzo Mbeki of the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. Mbeki had been with the unit for 11 years, had worked dozens of investment fraud cases, and was specifically interested in what Renata described to him as a probable wire fraud scheme involving misrepresentation to an investor and misappropriation of marital funds. He opened a preliminary inquiry on a Friday. Byron didn't know any of this. Byron was in our house, eating the groceries he'd bought, managing whatever version of the situation he thought he was managing. 3 weeks after I came home, Salvina texted me 3 words. Dwight confirmed Thursday. Dwight Calloway was the name I'd been hearing for years in the context of Byron's social world. An old business contact, a man whose opinion Byron valued, someone described as a connector, the kind of person who could make or break a professional relationship with a single phone call. Dwight had a standing dinner he hosted monthly at his home in Myers Park, a rotating table of 10 to 12 people from Charlotte's freight and logistics community. Byron had been attending for years. It was, by Byron's own description, his most important networking relationship. Salvina had been to 2 of those dinners. She had called Dwight directly, after Byron had ignored her 3rd request to repay the investment and restructure the arrangement. She'd presented Dwight with a summary of what had happened. Dwight Calloway, as it turned out, had known Byron's wife was alive and married to him for the entirety of their acquaintance, and did not take kindly to having his table used as a stage set for a fraud. He confirmed the dinner for Thursday. He told Salvina to come. I did not go to that dinner. Renata had advised against it. I was still healing. My presence could be construed as escalation, and frankly, I didn't need to be in that room. What I needed was to be somewhere quiet, with the phone in my hand, and my best friend Cheryl Okonkwo on the line keeping me from doing anything inadvisable while the clock ran. Cheryl had been my closest friend for 27 years. She's a psychiatric nurse practitioner, and one of the most perceptive people I have ever known, which meant that she had been quietly noting things about Byron for at least 5 years, and had never said them aloud because she loves me, and knew I had to arrive at my own conclusions. She said very little during those 3 hours. Mostly she just stayed on the line. At 9:14 p.m., my phone lit up with an incoming call from a number I didn't recognize. Loria, Davian's new wife, calling from a parking lot, she said. Her voice was slightly unsteady in the way that voices get when adrenaline is still moving through a person, but the acute crisis has just passed. She told me everything. Salvina had arrived midway through dinner. Dwight had let her in. She'd walked to the center of the room without raising her voice, the way someone walks when they've decided they have nothing left to lose by being precise. She named the lie about the divorce first. Said it plainly. No performance. He told me he had been divorced for 2 years. I have his text messages. She described the investment, said the dollar amount out loud, $31,000, in a room where people understood exactly what that number meant in business terms and in personal terms simultaneously. Then she said my name. She told every person at that table that while Byron sat in that room celebrating at his son's wedding, his wife was alone in a hospital bed 5 days out of a hysterectomy that he had attended for exactly 1 day before disappearing. She passed printed documents around the table, the investment proposal, the wire transfer records, a screenshot of the text where Byron told her things with his ex were complicated but almost resolved. Byron called it a misunderstanding. He used the word context several times. He suggested Salvina was emotionally unstable, that the investment had been a loan, not a partnership agreement, that the situation had nuance nobody in that room was equipped to understand, without hearing his side. Then Dwight picked up one of the printed sheets, the email thread, and read a section aloud. Byron's own words. The text that said he'd been divorced for 2 years, sent 8 months after our joint tax filing, which listed us as married filing jointly, which Renata had pulled from public record and attached to the packet because she is, as I said, 19 years of experience in this exact kind of case. The room went completely still. Chairs stopped moving. Nobody touched their food. The particular silence of a table full of professional adults who have just watched a man's constructed version of himself dissolve in real time. Dwight Calloway set the papers down. He looked at Byron for a long moment. The look, Loria told me, of a man deciding something rather than feeling something. Controlled. Final. Then he stood up, walked to the front door of his own home, and opened it. Byron walked out. Loria said Davian had sat at that table for another 10 minutes without speaking. Then he'd driven her home in complete silence, and she'd sat in the parking lot of a CVS for 20 minutes before she called me, because she didn't know what to say, but she knew she needed to say something. I told her she'd done the right thing, that none of this was her fault, that whatever she and Davian needed to work through, I was their family regardless of the rest of it. She cried a little. I stayed steady. I stayed on the line with Cheryl until midnight. Byron's key hit the lock at 12:43 a.m. I heard him come in, heard him stop in the entryway, maybe looking at something, maybe standing there in the dark adjusting to the fact of being home, then the hallway, then the office door, the soft click of it closing. He didn't come to the bedroom. I lay in the dark and listened to the silence from the other side of the house and thought about the specific mathematics of what he was doing in there, the calculation of damage, the inventory of what could still be managed, the construction of a version of events that could survive scrutiny. Byron had always been good at that, at building things, at making things look solid from the outside. He thought there was still something left to manage. He had no idea that Renata had already filed that morning, that the divorce petition was sitting in the Mecklenburg County Clerk's office with his name on it. That Exhibit A through Exhibit G included the ethics documentation, the wire transfer records, the restaurant receipt, the charger photograph, the warehouse business card, and a sworn statement from Terrence Whitlow, licensed private investigator, 26 years in practice, regarding the gap between Byron's claimed marital status and the documented legal reality. He had no idea that Detective Mbeki had escalated the inquiry to a formal financial crimes investigation after reviewing the original documentation, or that Salvina had given a recorded statement that same Wednesday, or that Byron's LLC was now subject to a financial hold pending forensic accounting review. He sat in his office and ran his numbers and thought he had time. 6 months later, the divorce was finalized on a Monday in April. North Carolina is an equitable distribution state, which means marital assets are divided by the court according to what is fair given the circumstances of the marriage and its dissolution. The circumstances in this case included documented misappropriation of $8,400 in marital funds, a pattern of financial deception spanning at least 18 months, and a forensic accounting report that found an additional $14,200 in undisclosed transfers I hadn't even known to look for. I kept the house. Byron kept the LLC. What remained of it after the financial hold and the investor restitution agreement Renata negotiated as part of a parallel civil settlement with Salvina. He repaid her $31,000 in full, plus legal fees, plus interest calculated at the civil fraud rate for North Carolina, which comes to a number that probably keeps him awake. The criminal fraud inquiry was ultimately declined for prosecution. The DA's office determined that the evidentiary standard for wire fraud would be difficult to meet given the informal nature of the investment agreement. Detective Mbeki was apologetic about this in the way that experienced investigators are when they've done their job correctly, and the system does what it does anyway. He told me the civil findings were solid, and that what Salvina had recovered was more than most people in her position managed. I didn't need him to go to prison. I needed him to stop. He stopped. Davian called me in February. We talked for 2 hours, the longest conversation we'd had in years, and the most honest. He told me things about the years before the wedding that I hadn't known, about the way Byron had framed our marriage to him, about the version of me he'd been given, and the slow, grinding process of comparing it to the actual person who showed up at the hospital at 7 a.m. on surgery day and kept showing up even when the person who was supposed to be there didn't. He said he was sorry. I told him I'd I'd been his mother for 29 years and intended to be his mother for the rest of mine, and that we could spend our energy on the past, or we could call it evidence and move forward. He laughed. A real one. The one I remembered. Loria and I have coffee on the second Saturday of every month at a place on South Boulevard. She's funnier than I expected, which Byron had never mentioned, but then Byron tends not to notice things in other people that he can't use. Dr. Fenella Osei Bonsu cleared me at my 6-month follow-up with no complications noted. My hemoglobin is back to baseline. The surgical drain site is a thin white line I can only see if I know to look. Ranata Pasco has a new client from the Charlotte School District, a colleague of mine whose situation rhymes with mine in several key ways. I gave her Ranata's number the same way someone once gave me a resource I didn't know I needed until I needed it desperately. I think about Salvina sometimes. About the particular species of courage it takes to walk into a room full of strangers, speak the truth in a clear voice, and pass the documents around the table and let the words do the work. We still text occasionally. We have coffee maybe once a month, sometimes with Cheryl, which is a combination of people and circumstances that could not have been predicted from any angle 6 months ago. She asked me once if I regretted that it took so long, that I'd been holding the thread of something wrong for years without pulling it. I thought about that. I thought about the night before my surgery, when Byron brought me a cup of chamomile tea and sat on the edge of the bed and held my hand and said he'd be there when I woke up. How much I'd needed that to be true. How much of my energy, for longer than I want to calculate, had gone into maintaining the conditions under which it could remain true. No, I said. I needed every piece of evidence I had, because when it was time to move, I didn't miss. She nodded like she understood. She did. Byron told Salvina he'd been divorced for 2 years. He told me he was managing something. He told Davian a version of his mother that served his purposes. He told Dwight Calloway's table a story about nuance and context. He told everyone a story. The difference is that I was the only one who kept a copy of the real one.